I want to start today with a question I've been asked more times than almost any other, in one form or another. People ask me how someone gets disciplined. They ask what the secret is, as if there's a switch somewhere that certain people were lucky enough to be born with turned on, and the rest of us were born with it turned off. And for a long time, I didn't have a good answer, because I didn't actually understand my own answer yet. I had lived it, but I hadn't examined it. So today I want to examine it with you, out loud, and tell you honestly how I came to understand that self-control is not a switch at all. It's closer to a muscle, and like any muscle, it can be almost non-existent in a person for years and then built slowly, deliberately, sometimes painfully, into something that quietly reshapes an entire life. There's an old idea, one I didn't come across until I was already an adult, that has stayed with me ever since. It's the observation that we don't drift toward the good life. We drift, when left alone with no resistance, toward whatever costs the least in this exact moment, regardless of what it costs us later. Left to pure drift, a person eats what's easiest, avoids what's hardest, says what feels good instead of what's true, and spends time on whatever makes the next 5 minutes more comfortable, rather than whatever makes the next 5 years better. That's not a moral failing. That's just the default setting of being a person with a nervous system built for the short term. And I think understanding that clearly, understanding that drift is the default and discipline is the exception you have to actively construct, is where everything else I'm going to tell you today begins. I was not a disciplined kid. I want to be honest about that, the same way I'd want anyone honest with me about their own beginnings, because the version of this story where I was always focused and controlled would be comforting to tell, but useless to you. I was the kid who started 4 hobbies a year and finished none of them. I was the kid who could describe, in vivid and convincing detail, exactly what my future disciplined self was going to do starting Monday, and then would not do it on Monday or the Monday after that. I had, if anything, an unusually active imagination for what a controlled life would look like. I simply had almost no ability to actually live inside that imagined life for more than a day or two before drifting back to whatever was easiest. I remember one specific moment from around that age that I think about often, because it was the first time I noticed the gap between what I intended and what I actually did, and noticed it clearly enough that it embarrassed me. I had told a friend with total confidence that I was going to spend the summer teaching myself something difficult, a skill I genuinely wanted, and I laid out this whole plan hour by hour, day by day. 3 weeks later, that friend asked me how it was going, and I realized, standing there trying to answer, that I had done almost none of it. Not because the plan was bad. The plan was fine. I simply hadn't done the thing the plan required. Day after day, because each individual day it always felt easier to postpone it by 24 hours, and 24 hours compounded quietly into 3 weeks without ever feeling like a single dramatic decision to quit. That's the first thing I want you to really absorb today, because I think it's the most underappreciated fact about self-control. Almost nobody fails at discipline in one large, visible moment. Nobody wakes up one day and decides consciously and deliberately to abandon their goals. What actually happens is 1,000 tiny surrenders, each one so small it doesn't even feel like a decision. You'll do it tomorrow. You'll start Monday. Just this once doesn't count. Each of those thoughts taken alone is almost too small to notice, but they compound in exactly the same way that discipline compounds, just in the opposite direction, and by the time you notice the pattern, months or years have often gone by. So the question I eventually had to face, sometime in my early 20s, was not, why don't I have willpower? Because I now think that's the wrong question entirely. The question was, why do I keep expecting a feeling to show up and do the work for me? I had spent years waiting to feel motivated before acting, waiting for some internal surge of determination that would make the disciplined choice feel as easy and automatic as the undisciplined one. And that feeling, when it did show up, was wonderful, and I got real work done during those windows. But it was unreliable. It came and went on a schedule I didn't control, often abandoning me right at the moment I needed it most. And I built my entire relationship with my own goals around waiting for a mood rather than building a structure that didn't require the mood at all. This is where the real shift happened for me, and I want to walk you through it carefully, because I think this reframing changed more about my life than almost anything else I've ever learned. Self-control is not primarily a matter of having enough raw willpower to overpower every temptation in the moment it appears. That model of discipline, the one most of us grow up believing in, gritting your teeth, white-knuckling through desire, relying on sheer force of character every single time a choice appears, is both exhausting and, more importantly, unreliable, because willpower behaves like a limited resource that gets depleted over the course of a day. If you spend your morning resisting one temptation after another through pure force of will, By evening, you have almost nothing left. And that's exactly when the real tests tend to show up. Real self-control, the durable kind, the kind that lasts for years rather than a few adrenaline-fueled weeks, works by removing the need for willpower in the first place. It's not about becoming a person who can resist temptation better than everyone else. It's about becoming a person who has quietly engineered a life where far fewer temptations are standing directly in the path of the goal. Let me tell you about the first real test of this idea, because it came from an unexpected place. I had for years struggled with something small but revealing. I could not sit down and do focused, difficult work for more than about 15 minutes before reaching for a distraction. It wasn't a dramatic problem. Nobody's life falls apart over 15 minutes of focus. But it quietly cost me an enormous amount over time, because everything I actually cared about accomplishing required stretches of sustained attention far longer than 15 minutes, and I kept failing to produce them, and kept explaining that failure to myself as a character flaw, a lack of discipline, a personal weakness I simply had to try harder to overcome. The turning point came almost by accident. I was working somewhere without a reliable internet connection for a stretch of a few days, purely by circumstance, nothing intentional about it. And I noticed, almost immediately, that my focus problem disappeared. Not because I had suddenly developed more willpower. The temptation simply wasn't available anymore. The distraction that used to interrupt me every 15 minutes had been physically removed from the environment, and without it sitting there whispering, I discovered I actually could sit and work for 2-3 hours at a stretch. Something I'd assumed for years was simply beyond my personal capability. That was the moment the whole model flipped for me. I had spent years thinking my problem was a lack of internal strength. It was actually a design problem. I had built an environment saturated with easy, immediate, low-cost temptations, and then blamed myself, morally, for being a person who occasionally gave in to them. Once I understood that, the entire project of building self-control stopped being about becoming a stronger, more virtuous version of myself through sheer effort, and became something much more practical and much more achievable. Redesigning my surroundings so that the disciplined choice required less willpower than the undisciplined one, rather than more. I want to give you the actual lesson from that, stated plainly, because I think it's the single most useful piece of practical wisdom I've picked up on this subject. You will lose, reliably and repeatedly, in any contest between willpower and a frictionless temptation sitting 3 inches from your hand. That is not a personal failing. That is how human attention works, and it works that way in essentially everyone, including the people who look effortlessly disciplined from the outside. The actual skill of self-control, the one that quietly separates people who accomplish what they set out to accomplish from people who don't, is not the skill of resisting harder. It's the skill of noticing, honestly and without self-judgment, exactly which small environmental factors keep pulling you off course, and then doing the unglamorous, invisible work of removing them before the moment of temptation ever arrives. There's a second chapter I want to tell you about, because it taught me something different, something about the relationship between self-control and identity rather than environment. A few years after the focus discovery, I set out to build a habit around physical discipline, something I had failed at repeatedly in the past in the usual way. Enthusiastic starts, followed by a slow fade, followed by a period of feeling bad about the fade, followed eventually by trying again with the same enthusiasm and the same eventual fade. I want to describe what was actually happening during those failed attempts, because I think most people recognize this exact pattern in some part of their own life. Each time I started, I would frame the goal entirely around outcome. I wanted to look a certain way. I want to hit a certain number. I want to be able to do a certain thing. And outcome-based goals, I eventually learned, have a specific weakness. They provide almost no feedback in the short term. You can do the work faithfully for 2 weeks and see almost nothing change in the mirror. And during that gap between effort and visible reward, the temptation to quit becomes enormous, because the goal, from where you're standing, looks exactly as far away as it did on day one. Motivation, which is what got you started, is a poor tool for this stretch, because motivation is fundamentally a response to the anticipated reward, and when the reward stops feeling close, the motivation quietly evaporates along with it. What eventually worked, and I want to be specific about this because I think the specificity is what makes it useful rather than just inspiring, was a shift from outcome-based thinking to identity-based thinking. Instead of framing the goal as something I wanted to achieve, I started framing each individual choice as a vote for the kind of person I wanted to become. Not, I want to have exercised 100 times this year. Instead, standing there at 6 in the morning with every reasonable excuse available, the question became simply, does the next 15 minutes cast a vote for the person who follows through, or the person who doesn't? That reframing did something the outcome-based version never could. It made every single day matter on its own terms immediately, rather than making every day feel like an insignificant fraction of some distant abstract target. I wasn't waiting for a mirror to eventually reflect a different person back at me. I was building that different person, one small vote at a time, and I could feel the evidence of that accumulating almost immediately, long before any external outcome showed up. I think this is worth pausing on, because I've come to believe it's one of the deepest truths about how discipline actually works in a human life. Self-control is not primarily about the big decision you make once. It's about who you decide you are, moment to moment, in 1,000 small forgettable choices that nobody else is watching and that don't feel significant individually. Nobody remembers the 14th time you chose the disciplined option over the easy one, but your own sense of who you are remembers, whether you're consciously tracking it or not, and it accumulates into a kind of quiet self-trust that eventually becomes the actual foundation everything else stands on. I want to talk now about failure, because I don't want you to leave here thinking this became a smooth, unbroken record for me after that realization. It didn't. There was a stretch, a couple of years later, where I let something slip badly, not physical discipline this time, but something with money. I had built decent habits around saving and spending, habits I was genuinely proud of, and then a combination of a difficult year, some real stress, and a series of small justified exceptions led to those habits collapsing almost entirely over the course of about 8 months. And I want to describe honestly what that felt like, because I think the honest version is more useful than the tidy version. It felt like proof, the same way the failed business felt like proof in a story I've told before. Not proof that I'd had a difficult year, which would have been a fair and contained explanation. It felt like proof that the years of discipline before it had been fake somehow, a performance rather than a real change, and that my actual nature, underneath the temporary habits, was still the undisciplined kid who couldn't finish a summer project. That is, I now believe, one of the most dangerous and most common lies the mind tells during a lapse, and I want to name it directly so you can recognize it if it ever happens to you. A lapse in discipline is not evidence that the discipline was never real. It is simply evidence that discipline, like any skill, degrades without maintenance, and that periods of unusual stress consume the exact resource that discipline runs on. Discipline is not a permanent trait you either have or don't have. It is closer to physical fitness, something built through consistent practice, something that can absolutely atrophy during a hard stretch of life, and something that can be rebuilt, often faster the second time, because the muscle memory of having built it once remains even after the visible results have faded. Rebuilding it that second time taught me something the first successful stretch hadn't. Because the first time I built discipline, I did it from a kind of blank slate, with no history of failure to contend with. The second time, I had to rebuild while also managing the shame of having lost it, and that turned out to be the harder part, harder than the actual behavioral changes themselves. I had to learn to treat the lapse the way I'd eventually learned to treat any other failure, as information about a specific stretch of time under specific conditions, not as a verdict on my permanent character. Once I stopped spending energy on self-punishment for the lapse and redirected that same energy into simply resuming the small daily choices, the rebuild happened considerably faster than I expected. I think that's worth remembering if you ever find yourself in a similar spot. The time you spend berating yourself for having slipped is time not spent actually recovering, and it is, if anything, actively counterproductive, because shame is a remarkably poor long-term motivator. It might drive a burst of intense effort for a few days, but it rarely sustains anything, because at some level, you can't build a stable identity around avoiding a punishment you're inflicting on yourself. You can only build it around genuinely wanting to become someone specific. There's a piece of this I want to address directly, because I think it's a trap, almost as common as the environmental one I described earlier, and it caught several people I've mentored over the years. There's a version of self-control that becomes rigid to the point of brittleness. The person who treats every single deviation from the plan as a catastrophic failure, who can't skip one workout without spiraling into abandoning the whole effort, who can't have one indulgent meal without deciding the entire week is ruined and might as well be spent indulging further. That version of discipline is not actually strength. It's a kind of fragile perfectionism wearing the costume of discipline, and it tends to break under exactly the conditions where real discipline is needed most, because life is never going to cooperate perfectly with any plan you make. The real skill, the one that actually holds up under the pressure of an ordinary, messy human life, is closer to what I'd call resilient consistency, rather than perfect consistency. It's the ability to miss a day and return the next day without treating the miss as evidence of anything larger than yesterday didn't go as planned. I think of it now almost like a boat's course toward a destination. No sailor expects to travel in a perfectly straight line the entire way. Wind and current constantly push the boat off course, and the actual skill of sailing isn't preventing every deviation, which is impossible, but continuously and calmly correcting back toward the destination every time the boat drifts, without treating any single gust of wind as a reason to abandon the voyage. Self-control that survives contact with an actual life looks far more like that continuous small correction than like some unbroken, flawless line. I want to bring in something I noticed later, once I started mentoring people through their own versions of this struggle, because it changed how I think about self-control's real purpose, beyond just personal achievement. I noticed that the people who eventually built real, lasting discipline in one area of their life often experienced something unexpected, a kind of overflow effect into completely unrelated areas. Someone who finally built consistency around physical training would, without any deliberate effort in that direction, start showing more consistency in their work commitments too. Someone who got their finances under control would often, months later, describe feeling calmer and more patient in their relationships in a way that had nothing directly to do with money. I think what's actually happening there is that self-control isn't really a collection of separate skills, one for eating, one for money, one for focus, one for temper. It's closer to a single underlying capacity, the ability to notice an impulse, create a small gap between the impulse and the action, and choose deliberately in that gap rather than reacting automatically. And that capacity, once strengthened in one domain, genuinely does transfer to others, because the muscle being trained is the same muscle every time. That's part of why I think this subject matters so much more than it initially appears to. Building discipline around something as small and specific as making your bed every morning, which sounds almost too trivial to matter, can genuinely start reshaping your capacity for self-control in areas of your life that have nothing to do with beds at all, because you are training the same underlying skill of following through on a commitment to yourself, regardless of how you feel in the moment. This brings me to something larger, something I think about now more than I did in my 20s, when this subject felt purely personal to me. I've come to believe that self-control, at scale across a whole society, might be one of the most undervalued forces in shaping how well any group of people actually does over time. Every meaningful outcome I can think of, in a life or in a civilization, sits downstream of a long chain of small decisions about immediate comfort versus long-term benefit. A person's health outcomes decades later are the accumulated residue of thousands of individual food and movement decisions, none of which felt significant on their own. A society's long-term prosperity is the accumulated residue of decisions about saving versus spending, building versus consuming, investing in the future versus extracting from it right now. None of it is glamorous in the moment. All of it compounds into something enormous over a long enough horizon. And I think this is why I've come to see the cultivation of self-control not as some private, personal virtue that only matters to the individual practicing it, but as something closer to a form of quiet stewardship, both of your own future and of whatever you're responsible for beyond yourself. A family, a team, a community. Every time you choose the harder, more delayed reward over the easier, immediate one, you're not just building your own future. You're demonstrating, to anyone watching, including people who look up to you whether you realize it or not, that the delayed reward is actually available to a person willing to reach for it. That has a kind of multiplying effect I don't think we talk about enough. Discipline, practiced visibly and honestly, including its failures and its rebuilding, gives other people permission to attempt the same thing, in exactly the way I've come to believe confidence does. The two are in fact deeply connected. You cannot sustain real confidence for long without some underlying self-control to back it up, because confidence built purely on belief, without the follow-through to support it, eventually collapses the first time reality tests it. And self-control, in turn, becomes far easier to sustain once you've built enough confidence to trust that you are, in fact, the kind of person who follows through, because you've done it before. There's one more chapter I want to tell you about, because it changed how I think about the entire subject, and it came from a conversation I almost didn't have. A few years after the rebuild I described, I was talking with someone considerably older than me, someone who had spent a long career in a field that demanded enormous discipline, and I asked him, somewhat naively, whether all those years of restraint ever felt like a cage, whether choosing the harder path over and over for decades ever felt like a kind of quiet imprisonment, saying no to so many things that other people got to say yes to without a second thought. His answer surprised me, and it stayed with me longer than almost anything else anyone has ever told me on this subject. He said the opposite was true. He said the years before he built real discipline were the actual cage, and I didn't understand what he meant until he explained it further. Before he built the habits that eventually defined his career, he described feeling controlled by every small impulse that passed through him. Hungry, he ate, regardless of whether it served him. Tired, he quit, regardless of what he'd committed to. Bored, he abandoned whatever he was doing for whatever felt more interesting in that instant. He described that period not as freedom, even though it looked like freedom from the outside, all those choices always available to him, but as a kind of servitude to whatever happened to be the loudest impulse in any given moment. He was, in his own words, not driving his own life. He was simply along for the ride, reacting to whatever appeared, with no ability to hold a direction longer than his current mood allowed. What changed, once he built self-control, was not that his options narrowed. It was that he finally became the one making the decisions, rather than his impulses making them for him. And I think that reframing is worth sitting with for a moment, because it inverts almost everything our culture tends to assume about discipline versus freedom. We tend to picture the disciplined life as the restricted one, and the impulsive life as the free one. But if freedom actually means having genuine authorship over your own choices, rather than simply having a wide menu of automatic reactions available to whatever shows up in front of you, then it's the undisciplined life that's actually the smaller one, boxed in by whatever impulse happens to be strongest in any given moment. While the disciplined life, however restrictive it looks from outside, is the one where an actual person, rather than a nervous system on autopilot, is doing the choosing. I think about that conversation often now, especially in moments when discipline feels like sacrifice, because it reframes what's actually being sacrificed. You're not giving up freedom when you choose the harder, more delayed path. You're exercising the only kind of freedom that was ever real to begin with. The freedom to not be governed entirely by whatever your body or your mood happens to want in this exact second. The version of you that can only ever do what feels easiest right now was never actually free. It was simply unopposed. I want to connect this to something I've noticed about how people talk about willpower versus systems, because I think there's a nuance here that gets lost if you only hear the environmental design argument I made earlier. It's true that removing temptation from your environment is far more effective than relying on raw willpower in the moment. I stand by that completely, and I think it's underused advice. But I don't want you to walk away thinking willpower itself is useless, or that character doesn't matter, because that's not what I actually believe, and I think it would be a disservice to tell you otherwise. Willpower is real. It does something. It's simply a poor primary strategy, because it's finite and it depletes over the course of a day, and it's unevenly distributed depending on how much sleep you got or how stressful your week has been. But as a secondary layer, sitting behind good environmental design, willpower still matters enormously, particularly in the moments environmental design can't fully protect you from: the unexpected setback, the emotional blow, the situation nobody planned for. In those moments, there is no clever system standing between you and the choice. There is only you, and whatever capacity you've built over time to hold steady anyway. That capacity is real, it is trainable, and I don't want the environmental argument to be mistaken for an excuse to neglect building it. I've come to think of the whole picture almost like two layers working together rather than one replacing the other. The outer layer is the environment you designed so that the disciplined choice requires as little willpower as possible in ordinary circumstances. The inner layer is the actual trained capacity to hold your ground when circumstances stop being ordinary, when the environment you built gets disrupted by something outside your control. Both layers matter. Neglect the outer layer and you'll exhaust yourself fighting battles you could have simply avoided. Neglect the inner layer. Thinking clever environmental tricks alone will carry you through everything, and you'll find yourself unprepared the day life inevitably throws something at you that no amount of environmental design could have anticipated. I want to say something directly to whoever in this room recognizes themselves in the version of me who couldn't finish a summer project, because I suspect there are more of you than might raise a hand about it. The story you've probably been telling yourself, the one that says you simply lack whatever ingredient disciplined people have, is almost certainly wrong, in the same specific way it was wrong for me. You are not missing an ingredient. You are, in all likelihood, missing a system, and a system is a solvable problem in a way that a missing personal quality never quite feels solvable. You don't need to become a fundamentally different, stronger person before you're allowed to start. You need to remove one piece of friction, anchor one choice to who you want to be rather than what you want to achieve, and expect, calmly and in advance, that you'll slip sometimes and return anyway. I think about all the people who look, from a distance, like they were simply built differently, born with some reservoir of discipline the rest of us didn't get issued. I no longer believe that story for any of them, the same way I stopped believing the equivalent story about confidence a long time ago. Every disciplined person I have ever actually gotten to know well enough to hear the real story has some version of the summer project I abandoned, some stretch of lost ground they had to rebuild, some ordinary human struggle with impulse that never fully disappeared, no matter how many years of practice they accumulated. What separates them isn't the absence of that struggle. It's simply a longer, quieter history of returning to the course after every drift, until the returning itself became the more familiar habit than the drifting ever was. The actual mechanics of building this, in my own life and in watching it work for others, come down to a small handful of unglamorous practices, and I want to name them directly. First, audit your environment honestly, the way I eventually had to with my own attention span, and remove the frictionless temptations sitting closest to the behavior you're trying to change, rather than relying on willpower to resist them fresh every single time. Second, anchor the goal in identity rather than outcome so that each individual day has meaning on its own terms, rather than depending on a distant, abstract result to feel worthwhile. Third, expect the lapse. Build it into your actual plan rather than treating it as an unthinkable catastrophe, so that when it inevitably happens, and it will, you can return to the course the next day, rather than spiraling into abandoning the whole effort out of shame. And fourth, start absurdly smaller than feels meaningful, because the goal in the beginning is not the size of the action. It's the establishment of a reliable pattern of following through, and that pattern, once established even in miniature, is far easier to expand later than it is to build from nothing under the weight of an ambitious first attempt. I think about the version of myself standing there, unable to answer his friend's question about a summer project he'd already abandoned, and I think about how many years and how many small, unglamorous corrections separate that version of me from wherever I am now. And the honest truth, if I strip away everything that sounds impressive about the story, is that I did not become a fundamentally different, more virtuous person. I simply got better, slowly, and with plenty of setbacks along the way, at noticing the small moment where drift begins, and choosing, again and again, long enough for it to become close to automatic, to correct back toward the course instead. I think about a garden sometimes, because it's the image that's replaced the muscle metaphor in my head over the years, even though the muscle metaphor is still accurate as far as it goes. A garden left completely alone does not stay empty. It fills itself in, but not with what you wanted. It fills with whatever happens to take root easiest, whatever spreads fastest with the least resistance, regardless of whether it's useful or beautiful or nourishing. Weeds do not require discipline to grow. They require only neglect. The vegetables, the things you actually want to harvest, require someone showing up day after unremarkable day, pulling what doesn't belong and tending what does, long before there's any visible reward for the effort. Nobody looks at a garden in its third week and sees much of anything. The evidence of the work is invisible for a long time, and then, all at once, it isn't. Self-control works the same way, and I think this is worth saying plainly because it's the part that discourages people most in the early going. The results are almost never visible on the timeline you want them to be visible on. You do the work of removing the weed, the small temptation, the automatic reaction, day after day, and for a long stretch, nothing about your life looks meaningfully different from the outside. This is exactly the period where most people quit, not because the effort isn't working, but because they've mistaken the absence of visible results for the absence of any results at all. The garden is not doing nothing during those quiet weeks. It's building root systems nobody can see yet. And then, on some day that never announces itself in advance, the compounding becomes visible all at once, and it looks, to anyone watching from outside, like it happened overnight. I don't say any of this to make the process sound easy, because it isn't, and I think stories that pretend it is do people a disservice. I say it because I want you to know, if you're standing in that invisible stretch right now, tending something that doesn't look like it's growing yet, that the not yet visible stretch is not evidence of failure. It's simply where the work actually happens, before anyone, including you, gets to see it. So if I could leave you with one thing today, it would be this. Stop waiting to become a disciplined person before you start acting like one. That transformation, if you wait for it to arrive first as some internal shift in character, may never come, because it isn't designed to arrive first. It arrives as the accumulated result of the choices, not as their precondition. Find the smallest possible version of the discipline you've been avoiding, the walk you could take instead of skip, the task you could start instead of postpone, the small temptation you could quietly remove from your environment instead of resisting all day. And do that small version today. Not because it will feel dramatic, it won't, Do it because each one of those small corrections is a vote, and votes compound silently into exactly the kind of person you've been hoping to eventually become. There was never a switch to find. There was only ever the next small choice waiting for you to make it. Thank you.